In this video, we're going to be looking at finding the coordinates of a midpoint. That's the point that's halfway between two other points. To start with, we're going to use a diagram to help us, but by the end, we're going to be able to do these without using a diagram. Before continuing with this video, you need to be comfortable with coordinates. For example, you need to know that A is at the point 1, 4, and something like C is at the point -5, 1, and D is at the point -2, -4, and so on. If these don't make sense to you, you need to go back to topic G11a. Now let's look at how we find the coordinates of the midpoint of AB. Now AB is a line segment that joins A and B together. So the midpoint is simply the point that is halfway along this line segment, right in the middle of this. Now, just by looking at this, some of you might be able to tell that the midpoint is right here. And that point has coordinates 3.5, 3. Now, if it wasn't obvious just by looking, we can do this using a systematic method. What we can do is count how many squares along and how many squares up or down we need to go from A to B. So starting at A, I need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares along and then 2 squares down. Now to get halfway along from A to B, what I need to do is go half of 5 along, so that would just be 2.5 squares along, 1, 2.5. And then instead of going 2 squares down, I need to only go half of that down, so only 1 square down. And that gets me to the midpoint. And then I can read the coordinates of this to get the same answer that we saw earlier. Before we move on, I'm going to show you how you could do this same question without using this diagram at all. Imagine we were only given the coordinates of A and B. So suppose we are given that A is 1, 4 and B is 6, 2. We can use this to very quickly find the midpoint of A and B. What we're looking for is a point where the x-coordinate is halfway between the x-coordinate of A and the x-coordinate of B. And that has a y-coordinate that's halfway between the y-coordinate of A and the y-coordinate of B. So what's halfway between 1 and 6? It turns out the answer is 3.5. What's halfway between 4 and 2? Hopefully it's obvious that that is 3. So that's all we need to do if we're given the coordinates. Now, what if we had some much bigger, more complicated numbers to deal with than these? Well, luckily, there's still a nice method we can use. To find out what's halfway between two numbers, what you're effectively doing is finding the mean of those two numbers. So to find out what is halfway between 1 and 6, all we need to do is 1 plus 6 and then divide that by 2. That's going to give us our x-coordinate. And then to find what's halfway between 4 and 2, we're simply going to add those values together and divide by 2. And that gives me the coordinates of the midpoint. Now, of course, I can't leave it like that. I need to simplify. 1 plus 6 is 7. 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. And 4 plus 2 is 6. 6 divided by 2 gives me 3. So this method here is a really good way of finding the midpoint of 2 points when you're just given their coordinates and you don't have a diagram to work from. All you need to do is look for the mean of the x-coordinates and the mean of the y-coordinates, and you get the coordinates of your midpoint. Let's have a look at example B. This time we want to find the coordinates of the midpoint of AC. Now, we could join A and C together to get a line segment and look for what's halfway along, but let's try using the method we've just seen. The coordinates of A are 1, 4. The coordinates of C are -5, 1. Now, the midpoint will have an x coordinate that is the mean of these x coordinates here, and the y coordinate will be the mean of these y coordinates here. Pause the video and see if you can work out the midpoint of AC. Here's what you should find. The midpoint will have an x coordinate that is 1 plus -5, all divided by 2. 1 plus -5 is -4. Dividing that by 2 gives us -2. That is the mean of 1 and -5. It's halfway in between those. And the y coordinate will be 4 plus 1, all divided by 2. 4 plus 1 is 5. Dividing 5 by 2 gives us 2.5. Now let's just see how that looks on here. -2, 2.5 gets us up to here, and that looks fairly sensible. And in fact, you can see to get from C to the midpoint, we need to go 1, 2, 3 squares to the right and 1.5 squares up. And to get from the midpoint to A, we should then have to go exactly the same amount. That's 1, 2, 3 squares to the right and 1.5 squares up. So that is the midpoint of AC. Now let's move on to question C. We want to find the midpoint of CD, where C has coordinates -5, 1, and D has coordinates -2, -4. Pause the video and see if you can find the midpoint for yourself. Here's what you should have got. The midpoint is going to be -3.5, or -7/2 if you prefer an improper fraction. And it will have a y coordinate of -3/2 or -1.5.